few days, just like hammering home on social and video how this process actually works, because I've noticed in the ways that people speak to me both on the air and off that like this is a really confusing, the nomination, how it happens is very confusing to a lot of people, including me, because it's unnecessarily confusing. So I'm going to read this, and please tell me if you have any questions, and I will Google if I don't know. So between February and June 2020, so that's that space of time we in now, all 50 U.S. states and several U.S. territories will hold a Democratic primary election or caucus, continuing with the Nevada caucuses on February 22nd. So we're past that now, and now we're on to Super Tuesday, or sorry, South Carolina, and then Super Tuesday. Well, U.S. territories don't have voting power in federal elections. They still send delegates to the Democratic and Republican national conventions. Then the Democratic nominee will be formally selected at the DNC, which will take place in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in mid-July by the delegates allocated in those primaries. But even though the nominee will be formally picked then, it will probably know who wins much earlier than that. Okay, so the primary process. To get on the ballot in the first place, presidential candidates need a lot of signatures. This can be expensive to get depending on the state. So for long shot candidates, it's often the first hurdle to getting elected. This also has the impact of forcing campaigns to have a baseline of financial and organizational capacity to carry them past the first obstacle. And it is one reason why lots of candidates tend to drop out right before big deadlines. This can even trip up otherwise competitive candidates, as evident by the fact that Andrew Yang will not appear on the Ohio ballot. When was this article written? Because he's out now. Okay. Yeah, well, he was out when this came out. It's interesting. Wait, sorry, hold on. Are you guys arguing with each other? Oh yeah, you're arguing with each other. Okay. So it's interesting to me that we stagger the primaries this thoroughly, and I have a lot of thoughts about it. I like, I told a colleague, I was like, we should just do same day primaries, like get it over with. He was like, no, we need staggered primaries, because staggered primaries allow us to have presidential candidates who are forced to localize their ground game, and that's important. They need to be out here campaigning for the issues that are going to affect individual Americans. And I do think that's very, very important. But it goes on so long. So let's think about the past 2 years of our lives. So last year, we had people starting to announce in early winter of 2019, which means that those people were preparing to announce long before, and the amount of money and organizational capacity that goes into that is tremendous. And then you start the campaigning process, and it goes on for a full year. The first primary isn't until February 3rd, and that's the first. And then we have primaries as late as June. Like, this is just such an exhausting process. And I know I complain about this a lot on the air, but when you think about all the capacity we spend doing this, and this is just to select the front runner. Like, this isn't even the general, which then is going to go July through November. That is not so. Like, let's take out the money and politics thing, because that could be a whole month of streams on its own, right? Like, let's just talk about the emotional capacity that Americans have for political and civic engagement. So one thing that really bothers me, and I'm sure it bothers you guys too, is because the presidential cycle is so complex and exhausting and just endless, you have a lot of people's emotional and political energy going towards the executive election, which makes sense. I mean, it's in all our faces. It is tremendously important. Like, there's no way to minimize the importance that the president has, especially over foreign policy and war powers and financial decisions. But there's so much else to civic life. There are school board elections, there's city council, there's state senate and state representatives. And when all of us are just consumed by this flashy media paradigm, then how do you budget out your intellectual and emotional energy for other things. Mr. Decrypting, Jocelyn, would you be in favor of decentralizing power back to the states in order to better localize both accountability and lessen the potential for extreme corruption? Or is there a reason I'm not seeing for that being a bad idea? I am in England, so maybe I'm missing something. Actually, no, Mr. Decrypting, I think about this a lot because, so you're a European, you understand better than I could, like, is that you go anywhere else and it just really hits you how big the United States of America really is. Like, this is just a huge amount of space with a population of 300 million people. And it's just overwhelmingly strange to me that we are all expected to come together. And I mean, it's weird, right? Because I'm not saying that states like split off necessarily, but yeah, the geographical size was one of the many reasons that the Federalists wanted to ratify the Constitution. Exactly. Like, I'm not really putting forth any solution in particular because a lot of people with really, you know, with a lot of research have a lot to say about this, but I do think it's really important to just acknowledge the sheer enormity of what it goes into navigating and governing the United States. Yeah, Sarduki, I could totally see some states being countries on their own. Right, you look at a state like California, right? So I lived in California for a year, and it's just, I don't know. I mean, I'm from the DC area, right? So the DC area is not like in 20 minutes you're in Virginia or Maryland. And you go to California and like LA and San Francisco, these could be two different countries. Like, these could be the like poles of two different countries, and the culture is so different and everything's so different. And it's just, it makes sense that our unifying political conversation is the presidency, because you have this culturally and sociologically diverse country, the United States of America, with so many people and so much land. And there are people who haven't even left their home state. Like, that's a real thing. And it's just like this big, diverse thing. It makes sense to me that the presidential cycle is what gets the most attention, but it is not the most important thing we should be focused on. Or even if you could make the case that that is true, there are also other essential things to consider. And it does disturb me that when people are so invested in carpetbags, Jocelyn, LA, you drive 20 minutes and you've gone 4 blocks. Oh, I know. It's one of the many reasons I would not live in LA. Although I do think it's lovely. And I have a lot of Angelino friends who are like, you'd love it. You're so artistic. I hate traffic. I hate it. I hate it. I don't like it at all. And but LA is beautiful. Yeah, but so you have this like dynamic where the media focuses on like one or two issues, and then naturally we all focus on one or two issues, but people can be very, very ignorant of what's going on directly around them. And by people, I mean all of us, just inevitably. Like, there is no MSNBC show about, so I'm currently in my parents' house in Northern Virginia. Like, there's no like big attention grabbing morning talk show about like the school board and what's going on in Fairfax, Virginia. Like, there's local news stations, but those are having like less and less funding, less and less attention. We're all sort of becoming increasingly tapped into this very flashy, very nationalized, very cyclical news orgy of whatever the president is up to. And that bothers me. Like, it's interesting because, I love Bernie Sanders. I'm really excited to be talking about him so much. But there's also a dynamic where we should be having local conversations with people that live right next to us about the politicians that, if you're in LA, you don't need to care about. Carpe Packs, I lived in Orange County for a little while and drove in LA on a regular basis. 4 blocks is an exaggeration, maybe 2 if you were lucky. I agree with your point. Yeah, it's crazy. And it's also really interesting to me May I ask who you support right now? Okay, so I support Bernie Sanders, but I like Elizabeth Warren a lot. In fact, that's an understatement. Like, I love Elizabeth Warren. I think she's done a lot of cool things in her time as a senator. And I also would happily vote for her in general. But I'd honestly vote for a lot of them. The only person I'm not going to vote for is Bloomberg. And you can write that one down. But yes, long rant about why I hate the monolithic nature of the media cycle. Back to this article. How the primaries work. So, the primary process. To get on the ballot, you got to do a lot of stuff. That's hard. This also has the impact of forcing campaigns to have a baseline of financial and organizational capacity to carry them past the first obstacle. And it is one reason why lots of candidates tend to drop out right before big deadlines. This even can trip up otherwise competitive candidates. Every state has a certain number of delegates to allocate, which is determined by a number of factors. So this is something I learned reading this article. Like, I didn't realize that it wasn't just solely based on population. Apparently, the number of delegates you get is also about, it's how big the state is, which I figured, but also how democratic they lean, when they vote, and if they vote with their neighbors. I did not know that. The DNC has 4 states who vote earlier in every election cycle: Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, and South Carolina. Well, these in South Carolina is the 29th, so that's Friday, I think. Yeah. Friday, is that right? Anyway, 29th. While these primaries hold disproportionate importance in the process by going first, they only account for 4% of the total pledged delegates. So, like, let's think about that for a second. Like, it's kind of nutso that the early primaries that we spend so much time talking about only take up a very, very, very small percentage of the actual delegates. Like, 90% of the delegates will be divvied up by April 28th. A lot of those are going to go on Super Tuesday. It's really interesting how the value of the early primaries isn't really just about delegates. It seems to largely be about how we view the candidates and how we view the front runners. Like, because the reality is we don't know yet. There is still so much that has to be decided over the next couple months. And it's why, if you are so inclined, especially if you're in a state like California, which is a Super Tuesday state, or Texas or Virginia, it is really important to get out there and knock doors. Like, knock doors, text bank, phone bank, digital bank, whatever. Propaganda, also the amount of money the politicians spend per vote, that turns out is a lot. That's interesting. Yes. Brad, do you have any interesting numbers on that? Because I would love, or that's really interesting. Yeah, South Carolina is going to be interesting, but then Super Tuesday. So I'm going to be going to Vermont for Super Tuesday because it is a Super Tuesday state. And it is also where our fair Senator Bernard will be. So that's my interest in being there. And hopefully we'll get some cool footage for you guys because I love you. Yeah. I'm from a Super Tuesday state. I thought about going. But I actually would rather be with my friends because Virginia, my district in Virginia, 6th district, it's wild. It's super wild down there. All right. And I've done a lot of electioneering down there. So I know. It's literally like a novel. Like, it's like a debut novel, okay? Growing up leftist in the conservative South. Don't worry. I'll get to that story in a minute. But first, back to the article. Okay. So, again, early primaries only get 4% of the pledged delegates. The earliest that other states can vote this cycle is March 3rd. Super Tuesday! Again, California, Texas, Virginia, Vermont. What else is a Super Tuesday state? The Carolinas, or North Carolina. There are a lot. It's like 15 states. The cycle is 15 states. And the Democrats who live abroad in the territory of American Samoa are holding Democratic primaries or caucuses on Sunday, allocating 35% of the total delegates on that day alone. It is a massive day and will be the beginning of the end for several campaigns, at the end and the end of the beginning for a select few. That's interesting. After Super Tuesday, primary dates get tactical, since states receive a delegate bonus for scheduling their primaries later in the cycle and holding their primaries on the same day as neighboring states. See, I didn't know that. In general, states want to balance their role in narrowing the size of the field with having the final say on who wins by having the most possible delegates at the convention. And this is where things get weird, and this is why people get frustrated with this process, because it's like, why would we not just write down the number of votes and then the person with the most votes gets the nomination? Like, it's like, you know what it feels like? It feels like that meme with the lady with like the triangles, and she's like, I don't understand. Because it doesn't make any sense. It's kind of goofy the way we arbitrarily, it's like you've got these delegates and you've got these super delegates, and it's a super intentionally complex process that leaves everybody off kilter and confused. And that is done on purpose. Because if you just say, oh, the popular vote gets the nominee, well, then you might get a candidate that people actually like. How insane would that be? The delegate system is arbitrary, and how they count is completely overcomplicated. Yes, exactly. And like, I almost wish I hadn't said overcomplicated, because complicated makes it sound like, oh, it's like intellectually stimulating. It's just so complicated for you plebeians to understand. It's like, no, they make it intentionally opaque so they can kind of do whatever the hell they want. And that's really, really scary. I saw an actual op-ed on one of my friends' Facebooks. It was like, maybe elites should have a greater say in who gets the nomination. And I was like, how much more say do they need? Like, they've already got this weird system of like, this delegate represents this many votes per importance in the democratic process. Like, why are some votes more important than others? Votes should be like a numbers thing. Like, we're getting real weird when you're starting to say, oh, well, like, this vote is more significant because it happened in Iowa. Look, man, and don't even get me started on the caucus process. Although, I mean, like, yeah, it's interesting and cool to watch a bunch of people in a high school gym scream at each other. It is ultimately not the most effective way of picking something as important as a president. I don't know. Just throwing that out there. Yeah. So, yes. And so this gets back to in general, states want to balance their role in narrowing the size of the field with having the final say. Okay. Some states, the ones on Super Tuesday, are willing to leave all the extra delegates on the table in order to get the first bite at the apple. Other states will wait until the last possible vote, smaller states like New Jersey and New Mexico, to gain outsized representation at the convention and potentially a shot at playing kingmaker. On April 28th, for example, 6 states in the so-called Acela Corridor in Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Maryland will receive delegate bonuses for holding their primaries on the same day later in the season. They also get a bonus because they share borders. Okay. Like, what? Like, cool. Yes, because you guys are geographically proximate and you've all decided to vote on the same day. 5 points for Gryffindor. Like, I mean, like, legitimately, like, don't get me started. The delegate, super delegate, sub delegate, primary delegate, it all literally sounds like, we're all in Hogwarts and Snape and McGonagall are just like 75 points for Hufflepuff. And you're like, okay, well, is this the nominee everybody wanted? Or is this just like an arbitrary process that should have been antiquated and thrown out a long time ago? But anyways, 60% of the delegates will be decided after the March 17th primaries and after the April 28th Acela primaries. the ones with the connecting borders, remember. 90% of the total delegates to convention will have been allocated, meaning we'll have a pretty good idea of who is favored to win the nomination by that point. Every state also has its own unique procedures for conducting primary contests. Some states have an open primary where non-affiliated voters and or registered Republicans can vote, while other states allow only registered Democrats to cast ballots. So in Virginia, they don't really like, I think I'm registered as an independent, so I can vote on both. But anyway, we will talk more about this, but we're about to have a guest by the name of Lydia. Perhaps you remember her. She's lovely and wonderful. TLDR, this is ridiculous. I do not want a presidential nominating process that reminds me of the Harry Potter books, though they do give me life, past, present, and future. And we will again be bitching about this more thoroughly after the Lydia break. And seriously, I cannot say this enough. Like, if you love someone, don't let them go. Go knock doors for them. And again, I'm not talking about romantic love. I'm talking about presidential love. So if you're a Bernie bro and you live in a Super Tuesday state, go do that. It's a beautiful way to spend an evening, day, morning, whatever.